Hey guys, it's Multiplier here. In this video, we're going to take a look at SynthMaster 2. It's used by some of the biggest artists in the world and it's one of my personal favorites. And this video will be a pretty comprehensive look at all the main features, all the most exciting parts, wavetables, multi-segment envelopes, LFOs, 2D envelopes, the filters, and even things like the modulation oscillators. As I say, it's arguably the most powerful synth I've ever used. And so before I actually show you specifically all these features, first of all, here are some of the sounds. This synth is extremely powerful. There are loads of things it can do and tons of options. And so let me introduce you first of all to the interface. Importantly, there are two layers, two independent layers. Basically, everything you see here is specific to a layer. These are your primary oscillators and these are your modulation oscillators, which you can figure in this layer routing here, using the modulation oscillators to either do phase modulation, frequency modulation, ring modulation, amplitude modulation, or even no modulation at all, basically using them as additional oscillators, commonly, for example, as a sub. Notice there are two filters in this routing, here and here, and some layer effects, all of which configurable. Also here, arpeggios in a layer effects configuration section, all of which can be changed. Noting importantly though, there are additional effects, global effects, additional effect buses that happen after each set of layer effects, all of which I'll explain later on. The modulation sources, the envelopes, the LFOs and key scalars are down here. All drag and drop. Modulations you configure in the mod matrix, noting very importantly, this matrix filters the modulations again, something I'll show you further on through this video. Settings are here, and on this Browse tab you can see all the presets you've installed, organized of course here, with preset macros called easy controls down here, allowing you to manipulate a preset without having to know how or why it works. And that is the interface. Now, the way you modulate and the visual feedback is extremely effective, extremely powerful. Let me show you. First of all, notice a parameter is highlighted if it's being modulated, such as this voice volume here. Give it a click and it appears in this modulation matrix off to the side here. Let me now define a few modulations arbitrarily. Now there are two main ways to do this. I could drag and drop. Noting again the great visual feedback showing how far that parameter is modulated. The amount of which I can adjust using this control here. The other way to assign modulation is to use the matrix directly, choosing one of the many modulatable parameters. Noting again the visual feedback here. Pulling this parameter back. Notice by default, this matrix only shows you the most relevant modulations. The filter mode is set to automatic. For example, if I click voice volume, the voice volume modulation appears. If I click multiseg 2, the relevant multi-segment envelope modulations appear. Now, a useful touch here is that if you say want to immediately jump to a specific modulation in this matrix, click the source to jump to that specific modulation. But I'm not just limited to this automatic filtering. I could select it from this target here or instead by source. For example, ADSR envelope 1. Or even no filtering, showing every modulation. Really cool stuff. Now let's take a look at these LFOs. There's some really cool things you can do with these. Now the standard shapes work exactly as you'd expect. You have speed, sync options, and the ability to re-trigger at a position in the LFO. You can set using this phase. So you can start an LFO from a specific position every time. But for me, the most interesting options are these three here: step, glide, and dual. Now step is a step sequencer, but you can curve each step downwards, allowing you to create riffs. Noting interestingly, it's looping these last 4 steps as determined by this loop number. You can add more steps if you wanted to, which of course is fantastic. Now let me show you this glide. Glide is similar to step, but each modulation glides into the next, which I find especially useful when also doing wavetable position modulation. And finally, a great way to make some extremely unique modulations is to use this dual LFO, allowing you to mix between 2 LFO shapes, which can be extremely powerful when choosing an unusual LFO shape. And of course, then slowing this down. And then use this phase to choose the most exciting section. And so, one of the most powerful sections now, the envelopes, in particular, the normal ADSR envelopes, but also, most interestingly, these multi-segment envelopes and these 2D envelopes. Now, there are 4 standard ADSR envelopes, and I've assigned number 2 here to filter cutoff, filtering a waveform from the profit. And so, to make this plucky, I could adjust the ADSR settings here. Noticing you can change the slope here and even the type of curve using this analog button. And interestingly, you can make this more steppy using bits, or even apply a bit of drift, or even snap to the grid using snap. But first of all, let me show you these more advanced envelopes. First of all, multi-segment envelopes. Notice you can choose the number of points and loop a section of this using loop start and loop end. All of which of course can be adjusted. Noting just like an LFO, you can sync this and snap these nodes to the grid, effectively quantizing and syncing it to the grid in your project. Here you can see each node snapping to a 16th division. But what about these 2D envelopes? These modulate 2 things at the same time. I could assign X to filter cutoff, and Y to pitch. Noting just like before, you set the number of nodes and define the loop start and end positions. And what I find can be rather useful is to set the end of the loop at the beginning. Something like this. Remember the X direction, so horizontally is filter cutoff and the vertical Y direction is pitch. And you use this section on the right to set the time it takes for each segment, most clearly demonstrated by adjusting this final segment length. Really cool. Next, let's take a look at the filters, and in the process I'll show you how to make this. Now there are two filters, filter 1 and filter 2, each of which configurable, noting very importantly there are these different types, each using different algorithms, modeled of course on analog filters, noting further there are different shapes for different algorithms. And if you see an acid button, this increases resonance as cutoff increases, giving you that very typical acid sound. Let me show you. So first of all, I need to turn this filter on by clicking over here, increase the resonance, and assign a modulation source, say an LFO, to filter cutoff. Activating re-trigger and increasing the speed just a touch. And then simply try this acid button. Listen to the lower frequencies. Neither better nor worse, but really cool. It's great to have the option. Now the filter routing, the filter configuration, this happens here. Following the lines, you have 3 configurations: series, parallel, and split. But let me show you my favorite filter shape. This dual filter with 2 nodes and a topology parameter. It takes quite a bit of time to get it just so, but when you do, modulating those peaks inwards, it sounds a bit like it's talking. Noting further, by default, key tracking is turned on, so filter cutoff increases and decreases as you move up and down the keyboard. More clearly heard if I change the oscillator source to noise. Notice with no key tracking, every note on the keyboard sounds the same, but with key tracking, filter cutoff now moves with keyboard position, which of course usually sounds natural. Now, as you can see, there are many different types of oscillators here, but for single static waveforms, I choose basic. As you can see, there are tons to choose from. Banks within banks, some are digital, some are analog, some simple, some complex, and for this example, what about Moog or Moog, however you say it. And just for fun, I'll add a reverb. To make this thicker, I could apply unison by increasing the voices here up to say 16, creating 16 versions of this. But for this to actually do anything, for it to sound thicker, I need to vary these using the Voices tab here. The most common variation, of course, being detune, changing the pitch of each voice, each of those 16 voices, very slightly. However, it's currently phasing, so to fix that, I click free for free running phase. Furthermore, I could spread these voices out across the stereo image with this stereo spread control. Filling out that 3D space, making it sound bigger naturally. Now, here's where things get interesting. There's this control called pitch drift, most clearly heard with just one voice. Hear how this pitch is drifting up and down? It's subtle. And most interestingly, when using multiple voices, it applies this to each voice independently. And so, if I use this subtly, all of a sudden this unison thickness evolves in a subtle, almost lifelike way. Before this drift, it's a very stationary, static, computery movement. And with this drift, it comes alive in a way you can't quite put your finger on. Fantastic. Great stuff. Now let's take a look at the wavetables. But first of all, what even is a wavetable? A wavetable is a collection of waveforms. So if I choose, say, this one, and use this index, I can move through this wavetable. And so therefore I can play a note and have the timbre, the sound of this change as I play it. Noting currently it's in 3D view, so you can see this whole wavetable, but you could change it to 2D view to view the currently playing waveform. Remembering that if you want to, you could pick just a single cycle from this. Simply set this index, this wavetable position. Now you can also create custom wavetables. Insert some single waveforms, completely randomly if you wanted to, and a wavetable is created. And furthermore, you can even import wavetables or folders of waveforms. You could take, say, a serum wavetable and drag it directly in. And you can even load in a random wavetable, which may sound simple, but it's extremely useful. It's a great way of making sounds using wavetables you wouldn't normally think to go to. So let's start to put some of these ideas together and create a tropical house lead. Now there's going to be 3 components to this sound, 2 of which are going to be in layer 1. And so I'm going to use this filter structure split, so I can run oscillator 2 through a filter but leave oscillator 1 unfiltered. Oscillator 1 will be a sine wave, and I want to give each component its own amplitude envelope. So in the case of this oscillator 1 sine wave, I can assign ADSR 2 to oscillator 1 volume and define a plucky shape. Oscillator 2 will be noise. Turn it on and define an equivalent amplitude envelope, but this time using ADSR 3. An almost identical shape, but with a very slightly longer decay time. You can see compared to 2. Then run this through a band pass filter, noting the routing here, oscillator 2 going through filter 2. Fantastic, but let's turn it down, so reduce this amplitude envelope amount to taste, of course, but I like it here. Noting very importantly, this is key tracked, so the filter cutoff moves with keyboard position. Next, layer 2, so I'll turn it on and choose a waveform, pitching it up an octave. And again, a plucky shape. Then mix this back in with layer 1. Giving it that bit of extra harmonic character. Remember, an octave up from layer 1. Then I can apply a layer effect, but only to layer 2, this additional harmonic character. Something like ensemble 1. Notice the subtle width this adds. And finishing this off with some global reverb, applying reverb to both layers. Next, the Arpeggiator. This does everything you'd expect, plus a few additional things too. Let me show you. Now, typically an arpeggiator takes a chord and plays that chord as a string of individual notes. Say up and down. At a speed determined by this bass time. Maybe even up an octave too. Noticing in this arpeggiator, it restarts once you reach the end of this number of steps. And you can even apply some swing offsetting every other 16th, delaying those even numbered steps. Notice the visual feedback here. Noting further, because of this step length, playing different chords gives different patterns, interesting and exciting melodies. However, SynthMaster's Arpeggiator goes a step or two further with this. Takes this preset here, a melody you may well recognize, which is made possible using this sequence mode. Noting you can draw in the notes on this piano roll. Adjusting the velocities if need be. Or alternatively, you can drag MIDI clips in or even record this MIDI pattern. And if you have keen eyes, you may have also noticed there is this drum kit option, which is best demonstrated by doing drum kit template. Either play it in manually, all of which velocity sensitive, or just like arpeggios, play the sequence. Noting that samples for each instrument are loaded into the additive oscillators using SFZ definition files. Now the effects in the effects routing in SynthMaster 2 are extremely powerful. First of all, layer effects. Take note. Each layer has different layer effects. Layer 2 and layer 1. You can choose an effect. Click to turn it on and drag to change the order and to configure these things. One way to do so is up here. Noting you can also do this here in the main effects section. Now, you can see here on the right there are two types of effects, layer effects and global effects, all of which configurable in this middle section. Most importantly though, the layer effects happen on each layer and the bus effects happen after the layer effects. Imagine two channels of audio, layer 1 and layer 2. Noting you use this section here to send out different amounts of each layer to bus 1, bus 2, or directly to the master and therefore dry. The possibilities here are huge. If you can imagine it, you can probably configure it. But let me show you two specific effects. The distortion, for example, allowing you to configure custom wave shaping options and pre or post filter if you wanted to. And with this vocoder, you can vocode almost anything at all, both from within SynthMaster, but also from outside using this audio input. Let me now show you the additive oscillator. Now, what this does is combine up to 8 individual oscillators as defined by this wave. And importantly, this frequency is the octave number. So this is an octave above this, and this is an octave above this, and so on. Noting you can change this number. And furthermore, just like the basic oscillators, you have these algorithms which can be adjusted using this tone control. However, let me show you a particular workflow I personally love. Turn on all 8 oscillators, then randomly load waveforms, somewhat randomly change each octave, then go pretty aggressive with the detune, go crazy with the pan, and then a small decay time reverb. And it can also be fun to push this detune further. Which of course you can keep randomizing. Lots of fun. And so the modulation oscillators. Now, as the name suggests, these modulation oscillators modulate other oscillators. It could be in the form of phase modulation, frequency modulation, or by using this drop down here, ring modulation or amplitude modulation. Additionally, you can use them as additional oscillators. For example, choose modulator 1, change this multiply to add, and so now it behaves as a very normal oscillator. Maybe choose a square and pitch it up 2 octaves in a perfect fifth, i.e. 7 semitones. However, things get much more interesting if you use these to modulate an oscillator. So I'll change this plus to multiply, therefore doing what's called ring modulation, which I can make more interesting by detuning with this fine tune. In fact, I'll also add a reverb. And then I could turn this ring modulation into amplitude modulation by giving this modulation oscillator DC offset. Observe the waveform as I do this. Then dial in this thickness, maybe push it further, increasing the detune. And then get this movement to move, this thickness to evolve using pitch drift. Remember, this is the modulation oscillator, so drifting the pitch or changing the pitch will change the speed of that movement you heard. It's subtle, but really brings the sound to life and makes it sound more natural, more real. Fantastic. Now, let me show you these oscillator algorithms. And what I'm going to do is create a very classic hard sync lead. If you're familiar with SynthMaster 1, this is this tone control, also similar to the warp control in Serum, allowing you to manipulate the waveform. And so if I choose a good waveform, apply some reverb, And then the magic to this hard sync sound is this sync algorithm. Which, when modulated by, say, an envelope, your classic hard sync lead. Next, velocity. The implementation is great and there's some really cool advanced features, which of course I'll show you. Velocity is a measure of how hard you play a note. Therefore, by programming this into your preset, you can get your sound to change as you play a note harder or softer, so it's responsive. Mirroring, of course, real life, where if you have a guitar or a piano or a drum and you play that instrument harder, it will of course not just sound louder, it will of course sound different. And you can program this into your presets too. This allows you to connect with the preset and play a more emotional, expressive performance. Let me give you an example. I have a Moog waveform going through an analog low pass filter with the cutoff modulated by this ADSR envelope. And of course a reverb. But importantly, I have set velocity as the via option. Therefore, the harder I play, the more this envelope opens the filter, allowing higher frequencies through. And so by playing the same note, I can be expressive by pressing harder. It's almost like I'm transferring my energy into the sound. Noting this mirrors real life, where the harder you play an instrument, the more energy you put into it, the brighter it sounds. So therefore it all sounds and feels extremely natural. And additionally, something I really love, this velocity error control. Adding in random variation to the velocity values, and even spread, varying the velocity from voice to voice. Really cool stuff. Fantastic. And as you'd expect, link below for everything KV331 and how to get the synth itself. I have been Multiplier, and I will catch you guys on the flippity flip.